And welcome, Hoosier fans, to another episode of Podcast on the Brink, your weekly dose of Indiana University basketball news and discussion. I'm your host, Jerod Morris. Podcast on the Brink is a joint production of the Assembly Call and Inside the Hall. For complete coverage of IU basketball, visit assemblycall.com and insidethehall.com.
It's time for Indiana basketball. Tickets for mini-series games are now available online at iuhoosiers.com or by calling 866-IU-SPORTS. Mini-series tickets are available in 6-game or 3-game ticket packages as well as individual games, so you'll have plenty of chances to catch the Hoosiers in action at Simon Scott Assembly Hall this season. Grab your tickets online at iuhoosiers.com or get them by phone by calling 866-IU-SPORTS. Go IU!
Hey everybody, it is Thanksgiving week, and on this edition of Podcast on the Brink, Alex Bozich and I get together to talk about what we have learned about the Indiana Hoosiers basketball team over these past couple of games, what Alex has seen up close being at the games from individual players, from Archie Miller on the sidelines, and what we should look for in Indiana's upcoming games against Arkansas State and Eastern Michigan, to get them ready not just for the upcoming Duke game, but the 5-game gauntlet that awaits the Hoosiers once this little 2-game stretch around Thanksgiving is over. So all of that and more coming up on this week's edition of Podcast on the Brink. Like most sports fans, you've probably found that buying tickets to sports and concerts too can be a complicated process. But here's the thing, there is a better, simpler way to buy, and that is with SeatGeek. SeatGeek is the smartest, easiest way to get tickets to live events because with SeatGeek's seamless mobile experience, you can actually buy or even sell tickets in just 2 taps. SeatGeek helps you find the best seats at the best prices, fully guaranteed, and there is nothing quite like seeing your favorite team or musician in person, and SeatGeek will help you get closer to the action for a great value. In fact, SeatGeek helped me get closer to the action last season when I saw Yogi play here in Dallas. I'll probably go see him again this year. And same thing for my wife this offseason. I got her concert tickets as a gift, and she really enjoyed it. And we did it all with SeatGeek because SeatGeek is designed to make the ticket buying experience easier than ever. They save you time and money by searching multiple ticket sites to compare prices and find you amazing deals. Now, here is what you should do next, because best of all, Podcast on the Brink listeners actually get $20 off of your first SeatGeek purchase. So there's that little bonus. All you have to do is download the SeatGeek app and enter the promo code BRINK today. That's promo code BRINK, B-R-I-N-K, for $20 off your first SeatGeek purchase. All right, I am here with Alex Bozich for this week's episode of Podcast on the Brink. Alex, what have we had? 2 games since we talked with your dad on last week's episode, the Seton Hall game, and then, of course, the South Florida game. What do you think we've learned? Indiana obviously played 2 good halves, 2 bad halves in that 80 minutes of basketball. What were the biggest takeaways that you had from those games?
Well, maybe the biggest takeaway was if Indiana could put the first half of Seton Hall and the second half of South Florida together, they would be a pretty good team. I thought that first half against Seton Hall was the first time that this team looked like, the gritty, hard-nosed group that Archie Miller envisions building with in Bloomington. I thought that was just a impressive performance to be able to go on the road that first half and be right in the game with the team that I think is going to be a top 20 team all season. And then last night, I was disappointed, obviously, in the first half, the amount of turnovers that they had, the sloppy play, but I thought the second half was really maybe just as impressive as the Seton Hall game, because it would have been easy for Indiana last night to let South Florida hang around for the duration. I mean, this team is not one that's playing with a lot of confidence. I think there's still a lot of guys who are uncertain, feeling their way through their roles. But last night, the 2 guys with the most experience on the court for Indiana really took over in the second half. I thought Juwan Morgan was excellent, as well as Robert Johnson. And so I think Indiana despite going 1-1 in those two games since we last talked, I think they've shown some improvement. I think there's some things to build on, particularly from the second half of last night. I think that the Seton Hall game will come in handy the next time they go on the road and do a tough environment. That wasn't a game that I don't think any of us before the season expected Indiana to win, but I think in time it'll turn into a valuable experience. I mean, the thing that we're looking for, I think, most with this team is improvement over the course of the season, and I think, despite the growing pains that we saw this week, the rough second half at Seton Hall, the rough first half last night, I think overall this team did get better in the two games.
What about from an individual standpoint, especially last night? Who really stood out to you in terms of, really stepping up their game and starting to seem more comfortable and starting to show real visible signs that they're getting it, in this new system?
Well, I thought Juwan Morgan was terrific after halftime. I thought the second half he was really good, aggressive, great on the offensive glass. That was really a crucial part of the game last night. I felt like the energy he brought early in the second half was just tremendous. Robert Johnson last night, I felt in the first half struggled to guard Peyton Banks, the former Penn State guard, had 15, I think, in the first half. Then after the first half, I think he only had 3 in the second half. And Robert Johnson, the thing that I liked the most about what he did last night, he did make all 3 of his 3-point attempts, which is great, but he did a really nice job, I thought, of attacking the basket, trying to find some seams, finish at the rim. That's one of the things I wrote before the season in his player profile was, from a physical standpoint, you look at Robert Johnson, he's the most imposing guy on this Indiana team in terms of just his frame and his build. I mean, he's not the most athletic, explosive guy, but if he can just get into the lane a little bit and try to force some contact. I know he didn't take a free throw last night, but he still did a much better job, I thought, of getting to the rim and finishing. I think he was 6 of 11 on twos, so I was impressed by that. And then Al Durham, to me, last night was also a huge part of the win. He's he played 31 minutes last night. I think he's played 60 minutes combined the last 2 games and hasn't turned the ball over for a freshman. That's just that's an incredible number. I looked at the Ken Palm numbers today, and his offensive rating, I think, is at the top of the team, if not at the highest number. He's got the lowest turnover rate of anybody on the roster. And the thing about Al is he doesn't try to do things that he knows he can't do. I mean, he's taken a lot of 3-pointers this year. He's with mixed success, but in terms of when he's got the ball on the perimeter, he does a really nice job of slowing down and making the right play. When he drives to the basket, it's because he sees an opening and somewhere for him to go. So many times these past couple of years, we've seen guys drive into the lane and then get up in the air with nowhere to go, and it would be a silly turnover. He's not doing that. And so those are really the 3 guys to me that have stood out. Anyone else for you, Jerod, at this point standing out from last night or the Seton Hall game that you really say, oh, this guy is going to be important for Indiana going forward?
I mean, clearly those guys, obviously Deron Davis is important going forward. He didn't necessarily stand out in these 2 games outside of, obviously Seton Hall was his worst performance of the year. And I thought he did a nice job in the second half against South Florida. And in fact, when Indiana kind of extended their lead and really pushed it out to kind of put South Florida away, there was a nice stretch from Deron that was involved there. And I think the other guy who has stood out is Justin Smith. And obviously he didn't get to play as many minutes yesterday, but he continues to be a guy who, like Al, is playing with a level of confidence and poise and just kind of a smartness within this new system, which for them obviously isn't new. It's the only system that they know, but that is really surprising. Like I think we all had high hopes for this recruiting class long term, Justin, Al, and Clifton Moore. But I don't think anybody expected Justin and Al to be as integral as they are early in the season, and for that to be kind of a positive. Like, it's not like they're just being forced in because everybody's gotten hurt and they're just playing all these minutes and they're kind of accumulating counting stats, but they're not being efficient. Like, outside of the turnovers for Justin Smith, those guys are being really efficient players, which is surprising in a really, really good way. And I think, obviously bodes well for the future of the program. But I think as they continue to get more comfortable, they'll continue to produce better. Now, they'll obviously get scouted, and I'm sure teams will try to take away things that they're doing well right now. But you can't be anything but encouraged by what they've been able to step up and do.
Right. And the other thing, when you look at both of those guys, is you hope that these experiences playing this much in these situations will be beneficial to them, and maybe the way it was for Christian Watford, his early days at IU. I know Indiana didn't win as much then as I think they're going to win now, but you look at the minutes that a guy like him, a guy like Jordan Holes, Victor Oladipo, Will Sheehy played in those early Tom Crean teams where, the success on the court wasn't what everyone wanted it to be, but those minutes really laid the foundation for all those guys to go on and have really good careers. And I think for Al and Justin specifically, even Clifton Moore, I thought last night gave some good first half minutes. He didn't do a lot statistically, but I thought, he set some good screens and, he made some smart plays out there. But you just hope that in the long term, that all of these things that these guys are going through right now, and maybe the team is struggling, a few years down the line, that they pay dividends because these guys have gone through it. Ultimately, you want a team that's being led by seniors and upperclassmen, and you want to be able to bring along younger guys slowly. But the benefit, I guess, of having to turn to some of these guys is that it really kind of speeds up their development.
Let's talk about a guy, and really a couple guys, who have been much more up and down than those guys, and that's Devonte Green and Josh Newkirk, a couple of guys who are using a lot of possessions and not using them with any level of particular efficiency. And Devonte is an interesting case because, he has had some spurts that have been huge. You think back to that first half against Seton Hall when Indiana was playing its best. Devonte was absolutely tremendous, hitting 4 threes and really making some big plays. And he has been an offensive spark plug at times when his team has really needed him to be. Unfortunately, he has also been a momentum killer at certain times because there have been chances, where it looks like Indiana's about to go on a run and he'll make a turnover and a bad defensive play, and all of a sudden it kind of kills the momentum. And I was actually surprised when I looked at the numbers today. And again, it's a very small sample size early in the season, but given kind of what we saw, from him in some of the exhibition play and what the expectations were, he has regressed in almost every statistic so far this year. Obviously, he's playing about double the minutes that he did last year. He's taking more shots, but all of his shooting percentages are down. He's getting to the free throw line less than half as much as he did last year. His turnover rate is up. And so, I think he's a guy who, as we move forward in this season, I don't think Indiana has the depth to where he can't play, and he continues to provide things that are unique for this roster that you kind of need to have out there. But I really think it's going to be important moving forward for Archie and for this team to kind of harness Devonte a little bit and find a way to get the good stuff without getting, some of those stretches of play where it just seems like he completely loses focus in the game.
Yeah, the turnovers to me are the most concerning part. And like you, I looked at his Ken Palm page, and his turnover percentage right now is over 30. And I know it's a small sample size, but you can't. I thought Archie made a really good point last night in the post-game press conference. When you throw the ball away 9 times in the first half as a team, that's 9 chances you're losing to score. That's even if you're only making 40% of those shots, you're talking about maybe 6 to 8 points that you're giving up just by careless turnovers. And Devonte is the guy who can hit home run plays. And I think we're gonna keep talking about this year. This was the thing that Tom Crean talked about, was like hit singles, hit doubles instead of a home run. And Archie's even said, the coaches talk about this, but you've got to just make the simple play, especially when you're playing a team like South Florida, who doesn't force turnovers. All of the turnovers last night that Indiana had in the first half, almost all, every single one of them was just because Indiana, for whatever reason, can't get out of its own way on some of these mistakes. And so I think if Al Durham continues to take care of the ball as he is, you're going to see guys like Josh Newkirk and Devonte Green play less, because on a team that doesn't have a lot of margin for error in terms of its offense, you can't be giving the ball. You give the ball away 9 times in the first half against Duke. That's probably going to be at least 6 or 7 dunks on the other end. I mean, that's just the reality when you get against better teams. And I think for both of those guys, they just, I don't know how. I'm not obviously not a coach. I don't know how you get through to somebody other than saying, if you turn it over, you're going to sit on the bench. And last night, I think Indiana's best lineups were when Al Durham was the primary decision maker with the ball, and Robert Johnson, I thought, did a much better job of taking care of the ball in the second half as well. So it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out going forward, because I just don't look at Archie as a guy who's going to continue to let these guys make mistakes and play a lot. It's just watching his demeanor on the sideline, the expectation he has for these guys. You can just tell he's clearly annoyed when they have these mindless turnovers. That's not how he wants these guys to play, and if they don't clean it up, I could see their roles diminishing. I mean, it's just the reality of the situation. Am I missing something here, or do you agree with that?
No, I agree. I mean, I think one of the interesting storylines as we move forward this season is obviously Archie wants to win as many games as he can this year. And I'm sure inside the locker room, they're thinking everything's still there. They can, play for a Big Ten title. They can go to the NCAA tournament, all of that. Obviously we have the luxury kind of stepping back to maybe look at it from a more objective viewpoint. But I think even Archie, as much as he wants to win this year, he knows that he's laying a foundation for the future. And so I think it's always interesting with a new coach who's coming in, especially a new coach putting in such a different system, with the holdover guys, especially seniors who are not part of the future of the program. How much patience does a coach have with them when their playing time comes at the expense of young guys who could really benefit from playing time? And I think what we're seeing is a guy who is fully bought in on both ends and is leading by example in the way that the coach wants, like Robert Johnson, obviously is getting patience. And Robert's playing 85% of the minutes. Archie obviously believes in him as an important part of the present and a guy who can help him lay the foundation for the future. But I think the question becomes a lot more interesting with a Josh Newkirk, who is not playing defense at the level that Archie wants and is not, compensating for that by scoring on the other end. Same thing with a guy like Freddie McSwain, who I really thought we were starting to be comfortable with being able to trust what he would bring on a nightly basis. But the last 2 games, he's really made some uncharacteristic turnovers, didn't rebound last night and just didn't seem like the same guy. And I guess, that leads into a question I have for you. I'm watching these games from 1,000 miles away on TV, and it's hard to see, but you've been there up close. And, you mentioned the intensity of Archie on the sidelines, and I think that is obvious, and obviously he got the technical last night that we were all very excited about. But what else are you seeing up close? Whether it's interactions between players and coaches, body language type stuff that is interesting or worth noting here early in the season. Because a lot of people have talked about, the bench hasn't seemed as excited at certain times. It certainly did in the second half last night. But is there anything that you're seeing that's worth making note of here early in the year?
Well, I've got an interesting vantage point at the games just because of where I've been seated here, the first couple of them. And, I've got a pretty good view of the IU bench. And just from watching how Archie interacts with these players, he's not really very tolerant of guys making silly mistakes. I mean, he's coaching them hard, which is what you want to see out of somebody who's taken over, trying to put their stamp on the program and trying to put their, install his culture, into some of these guys. And it's interesting to see kind of how different guys react to being coached hard. I think last night what you saw with Robert Johnson and Juwan Morgan, they responded in the second half. They came out and corrected some of the mistakes. And I just think it's a little bit different than what we've seen in the past, obviously with Tom Crean, where he wasn't on the guys as hard. But I think it's a good thing that Archie is coaching these guys hard, and he's really not backing down from the expectations that he has for these guys. He wants improvement, and he's kind of on the sidelines, he's into every play and every detail, and he wants to get things fixed as they happen. So I think it's refreshing to see that just the kind of the hands-on approach that he's seeing. I mean, there's it's definitely what I would call intense over there, which I think is a great thing.
This may be an unfair question, so tell me to buzz off if you don't want to answer it. But, you kind of mentioned Robert Johnson and Juwan Morgan as guys in particular who responded. And I think it's interesting that you mentioned the contrast with Crean. It's not necessarily a value judgment. There are different styles that win, and Tom Crean has certainly been successful with his style. But it certainly seemed like he was much more into positive reinforcement than maybe some of the intense reinforcement that you get from Archie. Are there any players in particular that you see maybe responding better or that may be struggling a little bit with it, which, again, would be natural, seeing as how it's only 4 games into this new regime?
Yeah, I don't want to throw anybody under the bus because, to me, from what I've seen, I think everyone's obviously listening and trying to do their best to make adjustments based on what they're being told. I mean, ultimately, not different tactics work better on some guys than others. And I don't think Archie's going to change who he is for any specific player. So ultimately the guys are going to have to adjust to how they're being coached. And right now there's a lot of work to do. A lot of guys have some catching up to do to grasp these concepts, to embrace the small details that he wants to have done on a game-to-game basis. And so, I don't necessarily think there's anyone who's not adjusting to it well, but you have to take what is being said and you have to, listen to it and try to get better from it. You can't, there's, like you said, there's different styles of coaching, and I think, Archie showed last night. He was fired up. When he got that technical, it was a loose ball that nobody got. He's talked a lot about 50-50 balls. He wants guys who are going to play hard at all times and mix it up. That's not to say that's not what Tom Crean wanted, but I think we can point back to examples over the past couple of years where there were certain guys who maybe didn't play defense or do certain things, and they weren't really, ever punished for it, I guess, with going to the bench, where I think there's a little less of a leash with this staff, and I think that's a good thing, especially when you're trying to get guys to buy in and listen. Hey, this is what's important to us, and I think right now the turnovers are the thing that's probably obviously the most glaring issue, and there's just a lot of small things, where guys are still trying to go too fast and make the home run play, where they just need to slow down and think through what they're doing. And I think that's one reason why Al Durham has done such a great job running the point, is that he's just doing making the simple play, and I think that's really what needs to be done across the roster. And so it'll be interesting to see how guys respond to as the season goes along. I'm sure it's an adjustment for a lot of them because they're being coached a little bit harder on the sidelines than they have in the past. But ultimately, I think it'll be good for them.
Yeah. Well, Alex, Indiana is in the midst of a 4-game homestand. Just had the game against South Florida. Obviously, the 2 games coming up, sandwiched around Thanksgiving, and then the Duke game. And so I want to look ahead to these next 2 games in particular, and let's talk about some things that we want to see out of Indiana to prepare them, not just for the Duke game, but obviously kind of the entire 5-game gauntlet that they have coming. Before we do that, let's talk real quick about Hoosier Proud, because you and I are both excited to have them as a sponsor now for Podcast on the Brink. We worked with them last year on the assembly call, and it's great to have them now here as part of Podcast on the Brink. And, Connor actually texted me last night and wanted me to remind everybody on the episode of the assembly call that, not only does Hoosier Proud and of course their website is HoosierProud.com, but not only do they now have officially licensed IU gear, but they just made a special t-shirt for the IU men's soccer team. So for those of you who want to support the IU men's soccer team as they look to capture another national championship, go to HoosierProud.com. They've got a special t-shirt. Of course, they have other officially licensed IU gear. They have official Inside the Hall T-shirts, and I know just from seeing the thread in the Inside the Hall premium forum, a lot of people have picked those up and been quite happy with them. And then Hoosier Proud has their original designs that kind of made a big splash when they first started. So if you go to HoosierProud.com, you can check out all of those really cool designs. Pick one up for yourself. They obviously make great gifts for anybody who is from Indiana or a Hoosier at heart that you may need to be shopping for the holidays. And what's great is, since you're a Podcast on the Brink listener, they want to give you a really big, a really generous discount. And so if you go to HoosierProud.com, and use the promo code BRINK, BRINK, you will get 15% off of your entire order. So that's not just 15% off the men's soccer shirt or one shirt or inside the hall shirt. It's the entire order, everything that you get at HoosierProud.com. So again, go to their website, browse all their shirts, pick up whatever you want, and then use the promo code BRINK at checkout to get 15% off. All right, Alex, so let's turn our attention to Indiana's next couple of games. We play Arkansas State on Wednesday, Eastern Michigan on Friday. Based on preseason expectations, based on current, KenPom rankings, the Eastern Michigan game seems to be the bigger challenge of the two. But just independent of opponents right now, Indiana has so many things to work on itself. And, frankly, Indiana has been its own worst enemy at times, just with the unforced turnovers and some of the occasional defensive lapses that we've seen. So they've obviously got a lot to clean up just internally before you even worry about the opponents. But pretty soon, coming up, that 5-game stretch, there's some tough opponents. You got some Big Ten games in there, and a few games that Indiana's going to have to at least get 1 or 2 wins if they want to have any hopes of keeping their NCAA tournament chances alive. So what are you looking for over the next 2 games to give you some confidence heading into that big 5-game stretch that Indiana's going to be able to compete and maybe win a few of those games?
Well, as we've seen in the Howard game and the South Florida game, nothing is going to come easy. I don't think, at least this early in the season for Indiana. There's like, as you mentioned, so much to work on, and they only beat Howard by 9. They only, they eventually pulled away from South Florida, but they were trailing that game at halftime. And you have 2 teams coming in who, on paper, I think are both better than those 2 teams. Arkansas State, who's I believe coached by Mike Bellotto, who was an assistant at Louisville up until last season. So he's got some familiarity with Indiana, some of the personnel, because he obviously Indiana played Louisville last season. And then Friday's opponent, Eastern Michigan, hasn't really been tested at this point, but their KenPom numbers suggest that they're going to be a pretty solid team. And so for Indiana, I think it's going to be interesting to see how they just the kind of energy they come out with. I mean, they haven't had great starts this year in every game. Obviously, the Indiana State start was lackluster. Last night, their first half performance was poor. We're going to keep coming back to the same themes, I think, every game until they're fixed. And to me, the things you have to watch for are, how are they going to guard the 3-point line? They did better last night in the second half, but the first half they let Peyton Banks of South Florida get off pretty well to a nice start. And then also, how are they going to take care of the ball? I mean, I'll be interested also to see the starting lineup. I know that Al Durham started in the game out at Seton Hall, and based on just kind of what Archie said last night about Josh Newkirk, it sounds like he's a little bit banged up and may need a little time off here. So will Al Durham kind of assume that role of starting point guard? Also, are we going to see Colin Hartman this week? It wasn't ruled out that he would come back maybe later in the week, and he obviously warmed up in last night's game, looked pretty good moving around. He's a guy I think they're definitely going to need for that 5-game stretch that you talked about, but it would probably be good for him to get a game under his belt this week if he can, if he's 100% healthy. So those are just some of the things I'm looking for. You never want to dig in too much to schemes with these opponents. There's just not a lot of information out there on some of these lower tier Division I teams. Obviously, you can look at personnel and things like that, but Indiana, I think, just needs to really concentrate on what it needs to do to get better. And I think right now the 2 most glaring issues are, 3, how they start games, how they're guarding the 3-point line, because I think they've been pretty good in terms of not giving up some of the straight line drives and some of the stuff we've seen in previous years, but they've had trouble covering the perimeter, and then the turnovers just continue to come up. And until that's fixed, I think it's going to be a theme all year. It
is going to be interesting to see what Archie does with the starting lineup. And I mean, obviously he made the switch in the second half last night, to start Al Durham, which I thought obviously was a good decision. I don't know how much Josh Newkirk being injured, had something to do with that, but I have to think that him giving up that coast-to-coast layup right at the end of the first half had a lot to do with it. And he did play a couple minutes in the second half, so he was available. But it's interesting, Archie has even said it's more important who finishes games, and Al, even though he hasn't been a regular starter, is second on the team in minutes.
Yeah.
But my guess is, and again, we saw it in Seton Hall, my guess is, I mean, if this continues and his turnover rate stays where it is and other guys continue to struggle, I don't really see any reason why Archie wouldn't start him just to get the team off to a more solid start, because if you can reduce some of those turnovers early, you just give yourself more of a chance to build some early momentum rather than building an early hole. And that seems like for a team that's kind of looking for confidence and maybe struggling to be confident consistently, seems like getting off to a good start would be really important. So I would anticipate that. I mean, we don't know what's going to happen, but that would certainly seem like kind of a reasonable move based on what we've seen and what Archie's talked about.
Yeah, last night too was really the first time that we saw kind of a pared down rotation. I would say in the second half. I mean, a lot of those guys played heavy minutes in the second half. There wasn't a lot of going to the bench, and Freddie McSwain barely played in the second half. Newkirk, and you look at Archie spent time under Thad Matta at Ohio State. You look at some of the minutes distribution at his Dayton teams. He a lot of times only played 7 or 8 guys, and to this point, 10 or 11 guys have been getting on the floor. It's going to be interesting to see. I think here as the competition level ramps up over the next couple of weeks, is the rotation going to get pared down a little bit? Are certain guys maybe going to see their minutes cut as he kind of looks to ride his 6 or 7 best players who give him the best chance to win? Because let's face it, that loss against Indiana State has put Indiana in a position where, as you mentioned, if they want to get themselves in the conversation to at least have a chance to make the NCAA tournament, they're going to have to pull off some wins here in this non-conference schedule and get some momentum going into the Big Ten schedule to kind of I guess you can't erase that loss, but they have ground to make up, and so I'll be interested to see just kind of how the rotation shakes out. I don't think it's going to be a thing where he's going to be playing 10 or 11 guys every game when we get into the meat of the schedule here.
It's also easy to, especially for fans like me that get so hyper-focused just on Indiana, and we get such tunnel vision during the season. And, you see that loss to Indiana State. You see, kind of Indiana struggles early in the season. And you can sometimes forget that other teams are having struggles too. Other teams who are supposed to be pretty good Big Ten teams. Like you just mentioned that Iowa took a loss today. I hadn't seen that yet. Northwestern obviously has taken a couple of tough losses. The Creighton loss, not necessarily a bad one, but I mean, they just got their doors blown off by Texas Tech, which is kind of a surprising loss for a team with that kind of experience and what they achieved last year. So, which I guess, is just to say, look, these are a couple teams that Indiana is, kind of supposed to be competing with in the Big Ten this year, at least, Iowa maybe more than Northwestern based on preseason predictions. But a lot of teams, kind of go through some ups and downs early in the season, and we need to kind of remember that before we, try and make any broad judgments about the rest of the season based on a small sample size of 4 games.
Yeah, I mean, Ohio State, Illinois, and Rutgers, I think, are a combined 12-0 at this point and haven't really played anybody. And so I think a lot of times early in the season, we kind of overreact to losses. I think Indiana right now obviously is going to have a hard time shaking some of the perception, I guess, from that terrible loss to Indiana State. But but beyond that, I think the season so far has played out pretty much as we expected. I don't think many people thought they were going to go to Seton Hall. And also you have to remember that they've been playing without Colin Hartman. How is he going to change this team? They could look like a totally different group when he gets on the floor. And so there's a lot of season to be played. We've only played 4 games of a 30-game schedule. I think in a lot of ways, unlike last year's team, it felt like peaked in the first month of the season. I think this team is going to look totally different here in 2 or 3 months from now.
But isn't it amazing how much things can change in a year? I mean, a year ago at this time, we were talking about Indiana as a possible Final Four type team, because they had beaten Kansas, the North Carolina win was coming up, and now here we are a year later, a new coach, a new system, and obviously struggling at 2-2, but things can change quickly going in the other direction too, and it's important to remember. And obviously, we all hope that the Archie Miller era brings more stability than what we've seen, in the last 3 or 4 years. But this could still be a pretty volatile season. But as we move forward, it could be in a good way, because I think the one thing about this team, obviously, they've underperformed maybe what they thought they could do early this season. But what I took from that first half against Seton Hall, what I think you could take from the second half at South Florida, is when this team kind of starts to get it and it starts to click, I think the talent and the ability is still there for them to make a pretty big jump later in the season. So I haven't necessarily changed my expectation for how good this team can be in February. I'm not sure the resume will be as good as what I thought it might be, but I still think that this team shows signs of being able to be pretty darn good down the stretch if they continue along with the steady progression that we've seen. It won't be, rapid. We're all going to still have to be patient. But I do think that through the struggles, there are some silver linings that IU fans can grasp onto to stay optimistic, not just about the big picture future, but even about what this year's team could do down the stretch to keep things interesting.
Yeah, I think as long as the confidence continues to build, and the difficult part about that is just the upcoming schedule. I mean, these next 2 games, obviously they need to win at home, but after that, you just look at what's ahead, and Duke at Michigan, Iowa at Louisville, and Notre Dame. I mean, they could play very, very well in that stretch and still only win 1 or maybe 2 of those games at the most. And I think they're going to maybe be favored in 1 of those 5 games, and that's the thing you worry about with a team that's still kind of coming together, still learning a lot under a new coach, and is going to play this tough of a schedule. You don't want them to become discouraged or lose confidence just based on playing such a gauntlet of teams, because as I mentioned, they could play really well and still come away from that stretch with only 1 or 2 wins. And so I think as long as they can make it through that stretch and still have some confidence and improve and be getting better, I think it's going to really pay dividends in the Big Ten, because I look around the league at some of the non-conference schedules that these teams are playing, especially some of the teams in the bottom half of the league. None of them are going to be tested like Indiana is being tested in the non-conference, and so they could have a leg up on some of these teams. It could be totally different when they get into the meat of the conference schedule, and so I think it's better to play a challenging schedule like this. Indiana could have scheduled super light and been 4-0 like some of these other teams have to this point. We really wouldn't know anything about this team, but at least with this schedule so far and what we're going to see here this next stretch, we're gonna have a pretty good idea of where this team is, what it is, what they need to work on, and hopefully the team can use the losses and build on them as the season goes along.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for your time today, Alex, and I hope you have a great Thanksgiving week. Obviously, you're going to be doing some driving around Thanksgiving, but hopefully you're able to relax on Thanksgiving, enjoy the meal, and hopefully a couple of Indiana victories around it.
Same to you, and thank you to all of our listeners who have tune in week in and week out. You're the reason that Jerod and I continue to do this. Obviously, we're very thankful for to be having another year under our belts here soon with this podcast, and we're excited, obviously, for the future. It continues to grow, so thank you to everyone who listens, and we hope everyone has a great holiday.
Absolutely, and we will talk to you next week, hopefully discussing a couple of IU victories, and a happy Thanksgiving for all. We'll talk to you then. Thank you for listening to this episode of Podcast on the Brink. We always appreciate you being here. To get more from me and from Alex, visit assemblycall.com and insidethehall.com for complete coverage of Indiana University basketball. If you liked this episode, please consider sharing it with a friend or family member who loves IU basketball as much as you do. You can also support the show by leaving a rating and review on iTunes, which helps us get the word out to more IU fans like yourself. We will be back next week with a new episode. Until then, as always, go Hoosiers.